That's such a bad gag.
It's terrible, isn't it? I'm ashamed. But the point was...
It's also verbally wrong, of course, because you didn't go up it.
No, part of me did, but the real thing that I said, and I'm convinced is true, there were a lot of MPs saying, what gay people do, is that what's shocking about love is never the physical part of it, it's the emotional part of it. It's not... People may do all kinds of things with their bodies, which may or may not disgust or alarm one, but it's how much of themselves they subsume in another person is something quite extraordinary. And it's so, it's the subject of most films and most songs, and yet it's so extraordinary that we never stop to contemplate how bizarre it is that's what we give ourselves to. And that is the secret of almost every human being you meet. If you meet someone who is an utter turd, and in life you will, you only... Don't do that thing they tell you is, imagine them all naked, and then you'll have contempt for them. That's not the point. Imagine the absolute truth of even the most aggressive, unpleasant, self-regarding, vain, unsympathetic person you could ever meet, and remember that they are not only desperate to be loved, but they are desperate to love. And I've never met a human being of whom that isn't true. And it is so astonishing that we don't even bother to think about it because it's almost too much for our brains to take in, I think. Anyway, sorry. There we are. I'll cover it later.
Folk music.
Folk music, yeah. Oh, you remember, I did the Britannia Awards, Folk Britannia or whatever, awards for the... I'm very fond of folk music, and I think... as always, like Martin Amis, who's been on this stage many times...
Are you getting a little obsessed?
With Martin Amis?
Yeah.
Well, I was. He's a great writer. Well, yes. But resistance to the cliché is an important thing. And when I was starting out in comedy, it always annoyed me when I saw comedians doing things that other comedians did, but not only that other comedians did, that anybody in a bar could do. So that if you said folk music, they'd just go like that. You go, that is the cheapest, it's like the equivalent of pornography in comedy. It's just like touching a sort of comic G-spot that is unworthy. That really, the comedian I'd respect is the one who came on and said, isn't folk music great? And make it funny that it was great. Because the idea that all it is Morris dances. Folk music is the music of roots music. You have to change the name to make people like it. But some of the most talented musicians, Kate Roosby, people like that, in Britain are folk musicians. And the music is deep and it's complex and it's exciting and it's unusual. I won't say that it's automatically better than any other kind of music, but that it is most certainly worth listening to. Yeah.
Genome. Where would one scroll you back to on your way to the Congo 2,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago?
Oh, me? Gosh. Well, John Lennon, we're all peasants as far as I can tell, I think was John Lennon's line. I'm lucky enough to have done, which I'm sure many people would love to, that BBC programme, Who Do You Think You Are, where you can at least go back to some extent in your roots. But again, the devilish part of me, although I'm very interested in the Fry family, and I was very interested in my mother's family. You know that old story about the invention of chess and how the emperor who had commissioned the best minds in the empire to come up with a game that was both fair, didn't give an advantage by luck, but also was complex. And this game inventor came up with chess, and the emperor said, "This is so brilliant, I'm going to give you any reward you want." And the inventor said, "Well, you see this board, it's 8 squares by 8 squares. If you could put a grain of rice on the first square, and put 2 on the next square, and then 4, and then 8, I'll take all the rice and that you fill the chessboard with." And the emperor thought, "Well, I got away with that easily, didn't I?" And of course, he hadn't got halfway before it became apparent that this was more rice than there was in the world. And that is the power of exponential curves, of the arithmetical progression of numbers. And it's the same with us and parents. We have 2 parents and 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, no? 512, 1,024, etc. Yeah, it soon becomes a gigantic number in a very short time, such that it is obvious we have, if you have any English blood in you at all, for example, choose England, then you must be directly descended from William II, if not from Henry III, a later one, because you have more ancestors going back then than the population of the country. So you must. There's no possibility that you aren't, even allowing for quite a lot of incest. And yet you meet someone who's called Bridgeworth, and they'll say, oh, yes, there have been Bridgeworths in this part of Sussex for 200 years. And you say, well, you know, 200 years, you have thousands of ancestors. And each one of them is as responsible for your existence as any other. The fact that we happen to live in a society that chooses the patronym, the one male that holds the surname, doesn't mean you're more related to them. If any one of those thousands didn't exist, you wouldn't exist. Now, this becomes important in a sort of xeno-philosophical way, in an ethical way. And in fact, going back to Cambridge, and E.M. Forster wrote a wonderful essay called On Jew Consciousness in the very early 30s, around the time of the ascension of Hitler and Nazism and the rather accepted face of anti-Semitism. He said, I'm not here in this essay, he said, I'm not going to argue about whether or not anti-Semitism is moral or immoral. I have my views on that, but let's just look at one side of it, about whether or not Jews are a stain and a bad thing. He said, let's take the best-known family in the world. He said, I would submit that is the House of Windsor. So let's look at the Prince of Wales, as he then was, the great Prince of Wales. You know, David, became Edward VIII. I do not believe that even the Prince of Wales could name his 8 great-grandparents, let alone his 16 great-great-grandparents. And if he can't, from the most famous family in the world, then how can any of us name our 8 great-grandparents? And if one of them is Jewish, or even a part Jewish, we wouldn't exist but for Jews. It is up to those who say, let's cleanse the race of Jews, first to prove that they aren't Jewish, and they won't be able to. The fact is we are so miscegenated. And that's really the point about genomes, is, you know, what do we base our identity on? It's really interesting. And when I was in Kenya filming in November last year, it was the American election, and it happened to be the time that obviously Obama won it. And I was filming. It's as if nature is like some sort of Gestapo figure who's going, you know, he's got his British prisoner of war, and there's his beautiful lunch, and he hurls it into a septic tank and says, there, go and enjoy it now. And it's these strange, damp, tufted areas of the human body that it just seems so bizarre, that matted and bedewed with strange moistures and peculiarities. Again, as no, things could have been organised better, one feels, and that's all.
Twitter, we need to do.
Twitter. Yes, now we have a particular thing to say about this, don't we? Because you very sweetly asked if I would judge your competition.
We did, and the competition was to find a beautiful tweet, the most beautiful tweet of the last month.
Yeah.
And what are the criteria by which you judge beauty in this?
Unbelievably difficult. For those not aware, a tweet is a statement given out into a social networking internet service or mobile phone service, but whose only rule really is that it must be 140 characters, that's to say letters that include numbers and spaces and punctuation marks. So you've got a very small canvas on which to create your work of beauty. One of the most obvious and first uses of Twitter for any aesthetic purpose was obviously haikus, because you could often fit a haiku into that. And I sort of felt, gosh, there are going to be some things that are lyrical and some things that will be well-shaped. But I wanted not to reward the sort of self-conscious tweeness that went into it, the poetical rather than the poetic. And the really poetic can be quite modern and also can be funny. I mean, wit can be beautiful. Because it expresses and distills an idea. And I'm particularly fond of the kind of wit that, the Chestertonian type, where some abstract proposition that sounds so laudable is tested against reality. One of my favourite quotations of Chesterton is when he was writing about feminism, and he said, well, I'm sure we're all in favour of women being given the power and the respect that they deserve. He said, but I read an article the other day that began, "At the trumpet call of Ibsen and Shaw, modern woman rises to take her place in society." And I thought, well, that's very good news. Let's see if it's true. Modern woman, modern woman. Well, there's Mrs. Carter, who comes in to clean my flat on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She lives in Tooting. She has 4 children herself, and she's alive now. She's a modern woman. And she looks after the houses and scrubs the floors in my apartment block and in many others, and she's a very busy woman. And if I say to myself, at the trumpet call of Ibsen and Shaw, Mrs. Carter rises to take her place in society, I realise the statement is not only nonsense, it's actually rather wicked nonsense. And that to me, that's beautiful as well as witty. It is the idea that you can make grand abstract statements, but unless you test them against an absolute reality, which is sort of what comedy does, but also what good art does, they are valueless. And so this is just a way of saying, I think this is what my winner does. It's not the greatest, I don't expect to fall off your seats laughing, nor is it, euphonious. I mean, if you ask someone to be beautiful in 140 words, what are you asking for? Something Keatsian, some beautiful, sensuous and sensual line. I think that would be inappropriate to Twitter. So I think I gave a number 1 and number 2. Are they up, visible? The runner-up, which is sort of sweet in its way, I think. How true. Isn't that nice? Fair enough. I think that's a good sentiment, well expressed, simple and clear. Yeah. I'm not sure that a Darwinian would say that is actually a good use of because in terms of logic, but it's very beautiful. And the winner is... I like that. Did you like that? It's good, isn't it? So, well done, him. Yeah. I think it is a beautiful way of saying, don't use phrases like build another world. This is our world. We must make of it what we must make of it. If you start being utopian to the point of thinking that there's an answer out there rather than in here, then you're very wrong. That's all. I think it's quite a good... Yeah.
Who would like to offer a U?
Uppingham, my goodness. That's rather scary and very quick. Are you all hugging to yourself V's, W, X's and Y's and Z's? Because that was jolly quick. Uppingham is a reference to the school that gave me a part of my so-called education back in the day. It was an old foundation. It was founded in the, way back when, in the Elizabethan era. But like many schools of its kind, it had a pioneering Victorian headmaster in the shape of one Edward Thring, who founded the Headmasters' Conference, which is still to this day the body which adjudges what is or is not a public school. If the headmaster is a member of the Headmasters' Conference, it's a public school, i.e. a private school, of course. Uppingham was, it is resolutely middle class, middle brow. It is not a place for intellectuals, necessarily, although some of its old boys have been rather splendid, how would you describe them, randy perverts. Ronald Furbank, Norman Douglas, I don't know if these names mean much to you. They were, in the day, rather celebrated. Norman Douglas's great book, South Wind, is still a masterpiece of that sort of style of decadent writing. He himself was expelled from island to island, from Ischia to Capri for interfering with young boys and young girls as well. He was a most disreputable individual, but in those days you were allowed to be, and he was considered stylish. Ronald Furbank, of course, was, gave rise to a sort of breadth of marvellous exotic literature, much liked by Evelyn Waugh and others. Flecker, James Elroy Flecker as well, who wrote Hassan, which is a rather fine work of sort of mystical Orientalism, as it would be called. Not that Edward Said would welcome the title. And who else? Oh, William H. Pratt. He was an Uppinghamian, better known as Boris Karloff. And the Campbells, Malcolm and Donald Campbell. But generally speaking, it produced what you might consider as amiable duffers. It was, you know, sport and being good and probably walking slowly towards machine guns in any war that was going to come, with a smile on your face and a cheerful disregard for your own safety was really what it trained you for. But I was expelled from it, and I had nothing but the most fond memories of very nice people running it. But I think the fact is, whatever school I'd been to, whether it had been Winchester or a local comprehensive, I would have had exactly the same problems. I was just, it was the strange aura of insane adolescence that I carried around with me, and the troubled nature of my mind and spirit, I suppose, was not made by that school. But they did their best with me. That's all I can say.
Vile Bodies.
Oh, yes. Vile Bodies. Oh, those vile bodies is the title of Evelyn Waugh's second novel, as you probably know. He wrote it, I think, in about 1928. And it's the novel in which he kind of wrote the... he wrote the society in which he had himself become embroiled, that of Mitford's and Brian Howard and Harold Acton and what were known as the Bright Young Things. And in the early part of this millennium, I wrote the screenplay and directed a film version of Vile Bodies called Bright Young Things. And it was a really interesting experience. It didn't set the box office on fire, but I'm still very pleased with the film. And apart from anything else, I'm pleased with the extraordinary cast I managed to assemble.